Howdy, my name's Tom Weiss. I'm a geriatric psychiatrist in beautiful San Antonio, Texas, and it's a lovely early spring day here. I'm sorry I can't be with the American Academy of Family Practice at this what looks like a really jam-packed with information and knowledge CME. But first and foremost, thank all of you for your attendance today. I know you're taking time out of your busy lives and practices to get more education and to collaborate with your colleagues. And that's always a good thing, but thanks again. So this presentation is not of the usual CME variety. It's not about diagnosis or treatment or pathophysiology or new medications. It's about some principles that were constructed 2,500 years ago. That's right, 2,500 years ago. And I guess maybe I'll ask as we kind of proceed through this, if these principles are still relevant, are they still alive? Do they still have meaning today for us as clinicians? And towards that, the first slide is not from Hippocrates, but from a wonderful poet, and it's sort of a pithy admonition that we should always be trying to improve. Man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? I think the Toyota automobile company has kind of a similar notion. It's encapsulated in a single word called Kaizen, which is, I believe, interpreted as continuous improvement. So I like this quote because I think it's a nice lead-in for the Hippocratic Oath. So must tell you a little bit of a story, how this evolved. About 18 months ago, a very esteemed clinician in San Antonio, Texas, asked me to do a presentation on the Hippocratic Oath. I am not a pan-Hellenic scholar. He really caught me flat-footed, but he's 85 years young. He's an absolutely dynamic fellow. He's established a kind of an empire of clinics to serve the disadvantaged in the poorer part of San Antonio, and his medical clinics are a Swiss watch. They're very well run. They go above and beyond the call of duty in caring for patients, not just medically, but also socially. And as I said, he's 85 years young. He still practices. He wears a badge on his white coat that says 60th year. So when he asks me anything, I always say yes. He said, can you work up something on the Hippocratic Oath? And then he took it a little further. He said, I'm very proud of our clinicians. I think they're very well trained. I think they do a fantastic job. The metrics support that. They're very well paid, but I'm worried. I'm worried that perhaps sometimes they get jaded. Sometimes they focus not on medicine, but more on business. And I wonder if you could maybe work up something on the Hippocratic Oath for a presentation to his clinicians. So that's sort of the origin of this. And, I think this quote from Hippocrates kind of speaks to this particular 85-year-old doctor who's not only actively practicing, but he cares very much about his fellow clinicians as well as his patients. And, these words are not often used in the practice of medicine. They're not scientific words, are they? They're emotional words. Wherever the art of medicine is love, there's also a love of humanity. So with that kind of setup, we'll proceed. So here's the Oath of Hippocrates. It's 8 short paragraphs. And I don't know if you recall taking this oath, maybe as you began your training, perhaps as you graduated your training, or at some different point in your training. I do remember reciting this oath at my medical school graduation, but honestly, I was too preoccupied with whether our two kids, ages 2 and 1, that were in the audience were going to create a fuss. So I just sort of blindly recited it. And to be quite frank, it was a blur. And when you think about oaths, they're sort of solemn promises, usually made before a much larger body. Maybe it's a religion, a church, a government, a military. I kind of think about the very few oaths that I've made in my life, maybe starting in grade school, the Pledge of Allegiance, kind of an oath of loyalty. And then when I was 18 and I enlisted in the military, I know I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And then when I married, I took an oath before God and man. And then, as I hinted earlier, I took an oath when I left medical school and started residency. So oaths don't happen often in our life, but when they do, they're usually pretty solemn occasions where we're making, a promise before God and our fellows to follow certain guidelines and principles. And I think about an oath of marriage, and I think about folks that I know now that have their 25th and 50th anniversaries, and what do? They renew our vows. So maybe this short time that we have right now is kind of a renewal and looking at this vow that hopefully most of us have taken at one point or another in our training or residency, or even maybe post that. So we'll proceed. So first, a little backstory about the man, about Hippocrates. Who was he? Well, as I hinted earlier, he came to this planet, if you will, makes him sound like a superhero, but he was born 2,500 years ago. And this was during the zenith of Hellenic culture that preceded the zenith of Roman culture. And both his grandfather and his father were healers. I don't know that physician was in vogue at that time. So you might say maybe there's some genetics here, the way the tree is bent, thus grows the sapling. But so he came from a family of clinicians. And what's important to keep in context is in that time, 2,500 years ago, disease was viewed as a punishment from the gods. Dissection was forbidden. That was a serious transgression. And treatment in those days was primarily with prayer and fasting. So you might say pretty primitive times, to be sure. So from that background, Hippocrates took a different perspective, a different angle of attack, if you will. He viewed disease not as a punishment from the gods, but as an imbalance in the body. And he recommended not prayer and fasting, but diet, exercise, bloodletting, and impeccable wound care. And he also began to sort of categorize illness by diagnosis, prognosis, and therapy. And his students that followed continued this categorization, and they actually created a body of knowledge called the Hippocratic corpus. These are some almost 100 texts from 2,500 years ago. I guess I'd call them sort of the ancient ICD-10 of medicine. So that's sort of a little teaser, if you will. And, I like this statement by Hippocrates because the earlier slide mentioned that He viewed disease as an imbalance in the body. He also defined health. He said health is not simply the absence of disease, but it's the balance of mind, body, and soul. So he's kind of incorporating physical, emotional, and spiritual elements. So he truly was, I think, way, way, way ahead of his time in terms of holistic medicine. So back to the man. Talk about foreshadowing. At one time, because of his views, he was actually briefly jailed. But then a plague appeared in Athens. How serendipitous, perhaps. And he was released. And again, remember, Hippocrates believed in observation. And he noted that ironworkers appeared to be unaffected by this plague. And he said, given that, he recommended that all cadavers be burned, all households maintain a fire 24/7, water be boiled, and that residents wear garments to cover their mouth. Gee, have we seen this before? And the plague resolved. So suddenly, Hippocrates was thrust into the limelight. Perhaps he was the Dr. Fauci of his day, and went from being sort of a jailed heretic with wild ideas to a celebrated healer. So celebrated that he became the physician to the king of Macedonia. He was also begged by the king of Persia, the arch enemies and arch rival of Greece, to be his personal physician, but Hippocrates respectfully declined. As time passed, he went back to the island of his birth, the island of Kos, and he began the first medical school where he could teach others using his precepts. So here's this remarkable clinician with a completely different idea about medicine and about treatment, about care, and very celebrated. He's a very humble guy, and he then dedicates his life to starting his medical school and training others to be healers. So another wonderful aphorism from Hippocrates: illnesses do not come upon us out of the blue. They are developed from small daily sins against nature. I love that line. When enough sins have accumulated, illnesses will suddenly appear. Well, this certainly is a truism, but we also know about all manner of acute illnesses, typically not from natural forces like car wrecks. But we certainly know about this as sort of a cascade, of elements that ultimately lead to really chronic, ravaging illnesses like diabetes and hypertension. So I kind of put together a little top 10 list of Hippocrates. This will be short and sweet. So certainly this renowned Greek physician, many, but not all, consider him to be the father of modern medicine. I know others hold this title, like William Osler, but certainly the original author of the Hippocratic Oath, and renowned not only as a healer, but as a teacher. So kind of a, very Renaissance-like man, and passed medical knowledge on not only to his sons, but his students, and started the first medical school. Clearly took a different tack in terms of what disease was. It was not a punishment from the gods, but it was an imbalance in nature. And number 8, very much, one might say, kind of a early thinker about the scientific method, that disease was a product of environment. Look at the patient's diet, look at their habits. And then he very much taught that healing was via the power of nature. Perhaps, for all I know, Hippocrates might be considered the first naturopath. the cleanliness, good diet, fresh air, and rest were healing forces. So this declaration, I think, is really thought-provoking and challenging. I think about this with my psychiatric patients often, that if someone, I guess the someone would be the patient in front of us, wishes for good health, they must first ask themselves if they're ready to do away with the reasons for this illness. Only then is it possible to help him. I think particularly about this with disorders of substance abuse. And then, of course, more evidence that Hippocrates had a really deep-seated belief into the healing force of nature, the naturopath in him. So to continue his accomplishments, so he was the very first to teach medicine as a discipline, if you will. He taught all of his students to observe the patient, record the observation, a written plan, not a verbal plan, that could be documented and passed on. So one might, I guess, also hold him to be the originator of the soap note. He also noted family history and environment. So this was unheard of at that time. In the past, it was all kind of oral history, nothing documented. Further, he wanted every assessment to include diagnosis, prognosis, treatment, and observation. So not only the soap note, but the progress note. He was the first to classify illness in different buckets, if you will. Is this condition acute or chronic? Is this disease endemic or epidemic? What about the phases of the illness? Does it have a relapsing phase, crisis phase, a resolution phase, an exacerbation phase? He was the very first to at least describe in written terms the illnesses of pneumonia, epilepsy, lung cancer, Graves' disease, and cirrhosis. He also is believed to be the first chest surgeon. He put a lead pipe in to drain a pleural empyema. And then last but not least, he began and originated the Hippocratic corpus that his students continued for several centuries after his passing. So quite a guy, one of a kind, to be sure. So I read this quote and I thought about when I was a resident in a neurology service, and I was listening to these neurology staff talk about the etiology of epilepsy. And at that time, and this is circa 1980, their conclusion was, we don't know what causes epilepsy. We're not sure why people don't have seizures all the time. So here we have Hippocrates describing epilepsy. It's thought to be divine because we don't understand it, but one day we will, and then we'll cease to call it divine. And so it is with everything in the universe. So not only a naturopath, but perhaps quite a philosopher as well. So here's a quote I dearly love because as a psychiatrist, when I diagnose and recommend treatment, it's not only psychopharmacology, but it's also diet and exercise and sleep. And here's Hippocrates declaring all parts of the body have a function if used in moderation and exercised in daily labors. And therefore, they become healthy, well-developed, and age more slowly. But if unused, they become liable to disease, defective in growth, and age quickly. What we call sedentary death syndrome in 2022. So here's the oath. This is an oath that most clinicians still swear to, although not all. Dates back to the 4th century. On the right, you can see it in the original Greek. And when I ask people, do you remember taking the Hippocratic Oath? There's usually this sort of brief days of wonderment. And they say, doesn't that have something to do about do no harm? And in fact, it does state do no harm in a kind of a different way, make a habit of two things to help or at least do no harm. But this is developed as an ethical code 2,500 years ago, wasn't used until 1,000 years later when German medical school graduates began to take the oath. And it wasn't translated into English until 500 years ago. And then in 1964, the traditional oath of Hippocrates was updated, if you will, to kind of reflect a different medical landscape, particularly in terms of ethics, specifically abortion and physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. So here's the oath, and I'm going to beg your grace. I hate it when someone reads something to me, but I'm going to read it quickly, and just after each of these 8 paragraphs, offer a thought. But I'd like you to kind of contemplate a thought or two. So the first paragraph is, this is a solemn oath to, at that time, the gods of healing in Greece at that time. So I swear by Apollo, physician, and Aesculapius, and Hygeia, and Panacea, and all the gods and goddesses, making them my witnesses, that I will fulfill according to my ability and judgment this oath and covenant. So this is a promise. He's making a promise, not only to himself, but to the gods. So, very serious here. Paragraph 2, to hold him who has taught me this art is equal to my parents. Boy, there's a powerful statement, that my teachers hold the same weight emotionally as my parents, and to live my life in partnership with him. And if he is in need of money, to give him a share of mine, and to regard his offspring as equal to my brothers and male lineage, and to teach them this art if they desire to learn it without fee and covenant, to give a share of precepts and oral instruction and all other learning to my sons and to the sons of him who has instructed me, and to pupils who have signed the covenant and have taken an oath according to medical law, but to no one else. So he's talking about the respect he has for his teachers and the respect he has for his students and what high regard and esteem he holds them. The third paragraph, I will apply dietetic measures for the benefit of the sick according to my ability and judgment. I will keep them from harm and injustice. Primum non nocere, first do no harm. But I particularly like the last word in that paragraph. Isn't that the word of this recent 5 years in our country, in our world? Injustice. Paragraph 4, I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody if asked for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. Similarly, I will not rob, I will not give to a woman an abortive remedy. In purity and holiness, I will guard my license and my art. So this paragraph needs a little explanation. In those days, in the royal courts of these kingdoms, Greece, Persia, quite often the royals had a number of healers in attendance, and they often used them to poison their opponents. So this is sort of what Hippocrates is speaking to. The fifth paragraph, I will not use the knife, not even on sufferers from stone, but will withdraw it in favor of such men that are engaged in this work. I kind of read that as, I will keep to my specialty and not to the specialty of surgeons, okay? The sixth paragraph is incredibly powerful. Whatever houses I may visit, I will come for the benefit of the sick, remaining free of all intentional injustice. There's that word injustice again, of any mischief, and in particular of sexual relations with both female and male persons, be they free or slaves. So he's talking about making a house call and not getting involved in mischief, kind of a broad spectrum word, but then he's very specific, particularly sexual relations. So when I read this, I think about the incredible scandal of 2017 of over 360 NCAA gymnasts who were intentionally um, sexually abused by physician Larry Nassar. So this wasn't a single one or two off. This went over 2 decades of sexual injustice, if you will. And the seventh paragraph, equally powerful, maybe more powerful because it's more pervasive and hidden. What I may see or hear in the course of the treatment, or even outside of the treatment, in regard to the life of men, which on no account one must spread abroad, I will keep to myself, holding such things shameful to be spoken about. So this is about privacy and confidentiality of our patients. And in a moment, I'll show you something that I think indicates that this in particular we need to hold dear. And then the last paragraph, if I fulfill this oath and do not violate it, may it be granted to me to enjoy life and art, being honored with fame among all men for all time to come. If I transgress it and swear falsely, may the opposite of all this be my lot. Now remember, he's swearing this to the gods. So that's an ancient oath, 1,500 years old. I don't know how relevant you find it. I don't know how you remember it. So again, I think not only was he a naturopath, but maybe he was also one of the first to get on the wellness bandwagon. Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. Here's a little more reminder about, he has to abstain from whatever is delirious and mischievous with his patients, and that to hold very dear the lives of men, to maintain confidentiality and privacy at the highest regard. So here's a Dear Abby letter written, again, about 18 months ago. Sorry for the way it appears on the slide. I work as a receptionist in a small medical office. I love my job, but I cannot tolerate when my coworkers make fun of our patients. Sometimes it happens while the patients are still in the exam room, maybe within earshot. Even the doctor contributes to this crudeness. Some examples. Did you see the size of that guy's nose? What's with the color of her hair? He smells like he hasn't had a bath in weeks. This goes on throughout the day, every day. Is there anything I can do or say to change this mindset? We have great patients. So Dear Abby, I think, gives a very succinct response. The person who's responsible for the lack of respect for the patients is your employer, the doctor, the healer. If this is happening sometimes within earshot of your patients, I am frankly shocked that he or she has a medical practice. There's nothing you can do to change the culture in that environment. I disagree. Perhaps she could begin by tacking up the Hippocratic Oath. Because it upsets you, you might be happier working for another doctor who has more respect for his patients. How salient. So, what about the modern version of the Hippocratic Oath? I mentioned that it had been updated in 1964 by a Dr. Louis Lasagna out of Tufts University. And this is much shorter. Instead of 8 paragraphs, it's 12 sentences. And I think it certainly follows the letter of the law for Hippocrates' original oath. But again, I think it's a little more germane, a little more modernized, but see what you think. So because it's an oath, we're going to swear to fulfill to the best of our ability and judgment this covenant. Notice we're not citing any particular gods. This might be maybe the agnostic version. Number 2, I'll respect the hard-won scientific gains of those physicians in whose steps I walk, and will gladly share such knowledge as is mine with those that will follow. So I will confess that sometimes I have been critical of physicians that have gone before me, probably because I was jealous. I will apply for the benefit of the sick all measures that are required, avoiding those twin traps of overtreatment and therapeutic nihilism. So I kind of read overtreatment, maybe I'm overanalyzing it, as defensive medicine. And therapeutic nihilism is there's nothing I can do beyond the protocol. I will remember there's an art to medicine as well as science, and that warmth, sympathy, and understanding may outweigh the surgeon's knife or the chemist's drug. I think we're beginning to find out that maybe the placebo effect also has some distinct biochemical mechanisms as well, and that the power of compassion can also be healing. Number 4, I will not be ashamed to say, I know not, nor will I fail to call on my colleagues when the skill of another is needed for the patient's recovery. When I was young and foolish, and a patient told me they were going to seek a second opinion, I would be offended internally. Now that I'm old and foolish, if a patient tells me they're going to seek a second opinion, I wholeheartedly encourage it. Because perhaps I have on goggles with tunnel vision, and what's important is whether the patient gets well and how they get well. Number 6, I'll respect the privacy of my patients, for their problems are not disclosed to me that the world may know. Patients don't tell us the intimate details of their lives for others to know. It's for the special relationship they have with us. Number 7, most especially must I tread with cares in matters of life and death. If it is given me to save a life, all thanks. But it may also be within my power to take a life. This awesome responsibility must be faced with great humbleness and awareness of my own frailty. Above all, I must not play at God. I think what those statements are powerfully self-evident. Number 9, I will remember that I do not treat a fever chart, I like that old-fashioned term, a cancerous growth, but a sick human being whose illness may affect the person's family and economic stability. My responsibility includes these related problems if I am to care adequately for the sick. How poignant is this in a time of COVID, when it was the dying human being and the clinician and the patient's family was excluded. Next one, I'll prevent disease whenever I can, for prevention is preferable to cure. So in my humble subspecialty, we're just now starting to think a lot about prevention of serious mental illness, tall order, but we are a relatively new subspecialty or specialty. And coming into the home stretch, I'll remember that I remain a member of society with special obligations to all my fellow human beings, not just our colleagues, but the world around us, those sound of mind and body, as well as the infirm. So they're all equal. If I do not violate this oath, may I enjoy life and art, respected while I live and remembered with affection thereafter. I was friends with a local practitioner here in town who had a migraine clinic, and was also a research guy, and he was suddenly taken away from all of us in a tragic motor vehicle accident. And when I went to his funeral, I was astounded because the line stretched for blocks. It was literally thousands of people, mostly ex-patients, who wanted to pay their respects. And standing in line, waiting to do that, I couldn't help but overhear the praise and the affection they had for this clinician. And last but not least, may I always act so as to preserve the finest traditions of my calling, and may I long experience the joy of healing those who seek my help. So how long has it been since you've heard that little phrase, the joy of healing? You know, the pandemic certainly derailed us. The pandemic disconnected us. The pandemic overwhelmed us. We just wanted to make it through that day, maybe even that hour, maybe even those 10 minutes. So I think only now we're kind of coming out of a long tunnel. Of course, maybe we're going to be derailed by the invasion, or as others call it, the special military operations. But the target is the joy of healing. So in summary, what's the Hippocratic Oath about? Well, this is what I take from it. Respect your teachers, not just at the moment of knowledge transfer, but throughout your practice. Pledge your life to the service of others. The bottom line is we're in a service industry, but it's a rather unique service industry. These are people that are hurting. Police are in a service industry. They're people that are fearful or in danger. Firemen are in the service industry. Place your patient's interests before your own. Boy, that's a tall order. Those are tall boots. Protect your patients from harm and injustice when you see it, when you hear about it. Treat all patients equally, old, young, disabled, non-disabled. Respect the patient's right to make decisions, even though you might disagree with their decisions. Continue to improve the care you give, the Toyota motto, Kaizen, continuous improvement. And then the bottom line, do not become intimate with patients. So kind of coming in the home stretch, here's another Hippocratic saying about the importance of once we get someone feeling better, we're on to the next mission, which is maintaining their health. So the function of protecting and developing health ranks even above that of restoring it when impaired. Sometimes we run into what's called the Hippocratic triangle, which is doctor-patient illness. And here's where we have to insert wisdom. So if we look at those three elements, the healer, the patient, the illness, sometimes external factors try and punch holes in that triangle. Cost effective treatment versus care effective treatment, which might be considerably more expensive. Defensive medicine, we're not treating the patient, we're treating the potential liability that might befall us. Public media, or as we know it now, Dr. Google, that clearly interferes with the doctor-patient illness, but it has some platform of benefit. Technology. I read with interest and with sometimes bewilderment the development of artificial intelligence for not only diagnostic algorithms, but treatment algorithms. And then lastly, adherence to protocol. Well, protocol isn't human. Protocol is black and white data pieces, and sometimes the patient gets lost outside of the protocol. So kind of a closing non-Hippocratic declaration. I have a problem with the doctor who takes a Hippocratic oath to do no harm, and a medical administrator who may or may not be a doctor whose oath is to watch the bottom line. Here's that convergence with or I should say that upsetting the apple cart of that Hippocratic triangle. So there is the oath. It's about the doctor-patient relationship and how it's the heart and soul of medicine, and that the healer's job requires not only moral conduct, but accountability, and that the oath that we swear allegiance to is a guideline. It's a guideline to moral dilemmas. So a tall order, but one we should aspire to. Man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? So in conclusion, maybe the simplest way to boil this down is what that 85-year-old physician concluded for me, that everybody I see, Thomas, I actually see my grandmother's face, and I treat them accordingly. So society respects what clinicians do, what healers do, for not only our body of knowledge, but also for our moral standing. So I'm going to simply declare that I think the Hippocratic Oath remains important, and I'll go so far as even sacred. And it's a great guide morally. And as you all well know, it's been adopted by the American Medical Association and the World Medical Association. So in conclusion, this is in Latin, not in Greek, but the translation is: life is short, the art of medicine is long. Opportunity with our patients is truly fleeting. Experiment is dangerous. Judgment is difficult. So we have hard jobs, but we have guidelines for practice that are incredibly important and still pertinent. So thanks for your attention. I realize this isn't your typical CME, but I hope it on some level is thought-provoking and perhaps a helpful reminder of why we do what we do. Adios from Texas.